inviting me today. So the paper I'm presenting today is still a work in progress. It's a paper I wrote together with my former supervisor, Professor Andreas Eckert, and my brother, who's at the University of Munich. And it is entitled From Simulation to Hyperreality, the Role of Simulacra in Visual Formats in the News Production and Consumption Process by Citizen Journalists. So historically, the news production process was exclusively orchestrated by so-called gatekeepers. Gatekeepers include elites and established institutions like the press, government bodies, and these entities decided what information was and how it was disseminated. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens like all of us here were relegated to the role of passive consumers. So we were largely subject to the gatekeeping practices of these powerful elites and institutions. With the rise of social media platforms, we are now witnessing a massive paradigm shift. Now, all of us are in a position to act as quasi-journalists, so what researchers call citizen journalists. We can just take out our phones, take a picture or a video whenever something newsworthy happens, like a protest, and upload it on social media platforms. So citizen journalism obviously comes with a range of opportunities. This includes empowerment. All of us are now empowered to act as sort of journalists. We're not only consumers of news, but we can engage in the production of news. So we are sort of prosumers. And through the capacity to freely exchange information, this can lead to greater information democratization. We are also in a position now to counterbalance the biases of mainstream media. If we are dissatisfied with how the ORF portrays some newsworthy event, we can simply consume different kinds of news, or we can also engage in the production of news. At the same time, however, we are also witnessing massive challenges. This includes a rise of misinformation and fake news, more radical and extreme narratives that are often mediated through images and videos, as well as greater polarization. For those of you who are unfamiliar with polarization, you may have noticed that whenever you click on something, you usually encounter the same information again. So in fact, we're not witnessing information democratization, but more homogeneous data. So how do we make sense of this dual nature, these extreme discourses that unfold on social media platforms? Well, in this paper, we draw on Baudrillard's work, Simulacra and Simulation. The main argument that we are making is that social media platforms create a hyper-real environment. According to Baudrillard, hyperreality represents a state in which physical reality and its social media simulations becomes indistinct. What does it mean? Well, it becomes increasingly difficult for us to discern what is real and what is merely fabricated. Baudrillard argues that hyperreality emerges from the pervasive simulation of so-called simulacra. In its most basic sense, simulacra are copies of reality, things that attempt to represent what reality is. Throughout history, there have been numerous instances of how these simulacra have created these hyperreal spaces. As an example, relics like fragments of the True Cross or St. Bones were venerated across Europe, with many being replicas of fabricated items. So although these items were not actually real, many believed in the authenticity of these items, which in turn gave it a reality of their own. Some of you have heard of these fake villages and cities in North Korea. And these have been created in order to create a hyper-real representation of North Korea as a country that is actually very rich and doing quite well. This again sort of represents the idea of hyper-reality. But the example that Baudrillard likes to use is Disneyland. Why does he use Disneyland? Because Disneyland emerges not from physical reality, but it emerges from stories, fairy tales. And these narratives, in turn, have a tangible impact on what is happening in the physical world. And often we're not aware of that. We enter Disneyland and we are kind of so immersed in what is happening. So the distinction between physical reality and these stories is imploding. In this paper, however, we are interested in simulacra in visual formats. So images, and videos. Again, if you take a look back into history, we can see how these images and videos have been exploited by gatekeepers to create these hyperreal narratives. As an example, regimes like Nazi Germany exploited images in order to portray Jewish people as inherently evil. But even in more recent times, images and videos have been exploited repeatedly to fabricate an image of warfare as something that is done in the name of humanitarian benevolence, whereas the atrocities and the adverse effects that are tied to these conflicts have often been omitted. But as I mentioned before, now all of us have been conferred the power of Simulacra. All of us can create images and videos and spread them on social media platforms. So we are now involved in this the creation of hyperreal spaces. If you look into prior research, we know that whenever something newsworthy happens, like protests, conflicts, or other emotionally charged contexts, images and videos spread rapidly on social media platforms. And as these images and videos spread, they not only reflect what is going on in the physical world, but they sort of try to challenge it. How do they do so? Well, on the one hand, images and videos serve to project the struggles that people are experiencing in the physical world, to emulate real-world battles. But we also know that images and videos or other kinds of information can shape behavioral intentions to the extent of sparking protests that are intended to challenge entrenched hierarchies in the physical world. So this leads to something Warbeer calls implosion. Does physical reality shape social media simulations, or does the social media environment shape the physical world? And this is becoming increasingly difficult to discern, as we have seen in the recent conflicts. There are, however, two things that warrant further research. How do these hyperreal spaces on social media platforms emerge? Why are we not able to distinguish what is real and merely fabricated information? Or more simply, is there a difference between an image that shows actual warfare versus an image that has been AI generated? This brings us to the first research question. How do different forms of simulacra, ranging from conflict-laden images to memes, operate within social media simulations of hyperreality, thereby cultivating hyperreal spaces? And related to this question is, how do users exploit these images and videos? How do they engage with it? Is there a difference between a meme, or an image that shows civilians, or an image that shows dead civilians, in the forms of engagement it tends to elicit? How do citizen journalists engage with simulacra in the news production and consumption? So to address this research question, we draw on a very useful way to think about representations. It is a sort of taxonomy that Baudrillard developed. So in essence, he distinguishes between four phases of simulacra, four ways to represent things. And to make it very simple, I will use a selfie image as an example to explain these phases. So the first phase are faithful representations of reality. There might be a selfie of myself that has not been edited and has been taken in very good lighting and accurately represents of how I'm standing here right in front of you. As we move to the second order or phase, we are witnessing distortions in representation of reality. There might be an image that I've taken of myself with Snapchat, so I put on a filter or something like that to make myself appear more attractive or whatever. As you move to the third phase, things become increasingly detached from physical reality. So there might be a selfie that I have taken and then processed through generative artificial intelligence, which leads to an entirely new image. And although it is anchored in physical reality, it is also becoming increasingly detached from it. And the fourth space, or fourth order, are any kind of images that create these hyperreal spaces. And this is the final phase, this is how we construe or understand social media platforms. So what did we do? Well, to address our research questions, we collected a large data set during the Israel-Hamas war. And we analyzed that using semiotics based on the guidelines by Rose. We specifically investigated Reddit. Reddit is an enormous platform that received more than 2 billion visitors and over 500 million active users in 2024. We examined two subforums. So one is dedicated to discussions on Israel, and one is dedicated to discussions on Palestine. Both of these platforms have more than 200,000 subscribers and were highly active during the Israel-Hamas war. In essence, our analysis unfolded in 3 steps. We begin with an open coding approach, analyze our images and videos along the 3 phases by Baudrillard's taxonomy, and then attempted to discern patterns. So what did we find? In essence, we find 6 subcategories of simulacra, which we analyze along the 3 phases. And what we find is that as we move up these phases, things become increasingly hyperreal. So we are able to trace how these hyperreal spaces emerge. An important takeaway is that images and videos do not exist in isolation. Instead, they exhibit what we call intertextual relationships. By intertextual relationships, we mean that we cannot see them by itself. Instead, every image and video that is shared on a subforum subsequently influences other forms of engagement. But since this is all highly abstract, we will just go step by step through all phases to trace the emergence of these hyperreal spaces. Let's begin with the first phase, which is very easy to understand. The first phase is any kind of images and videos that we classified in the first phase do kind of resemble the idea of faithful representations. And what we mean by faithful representations is that these images and videos tend to not be very much edited, and they retain high fidelity to what is actually happening during the Israel-Hamas war. However, what is interesting about these images and videos, that despite them being quite faithful, they usually show one side of the Israel-Hamas war, whereas omitting other perspectives. This means that from the Palestinian viewpoint, these first phase simulacra only comprise pro-Palestinian viewpoints, and from the Israeli perspective, they only show pro-Israeli viewpoints. So what they essentially do is magnify physical reality. And this magnification happens through immersive and proxy-based simulacra, which we will see in the following slides. When it comes to the engagement among citizen journalists, it tends to be quite predictable in the sense that it is reactive. But let's look into an example. This is a video that has been shared on the Palestinian subforum. It is something we called immersive simulacra. So we classified it within the first phase. We called it immersive because what it does is it magnifies one viewpoint, in this case, the Palestinian viewpoint, and it puts you face to face what is happening during the warfare. And as this magnification happens, what we can usually observe is a close link between the indexical attributes. Indexical attributes are any kind of evidences an image provides. In this case, what it evidences is the emotional distress this child is going through. So this emotional distress leads to very emotional engagement among these citizen journalists. For example, the posting user claims heartbreak after heartbreak. Comment 1 claims, this is so heartbreaking. Comment 2 claims, this is incredibly heart-wrenching. So magnification, reaction. In parallel, we can observe the same dynamic happening on the Israeli subforum. Here, we are immersed into a wedding taking place as Israel is being attacked by Iran. Again, reality is being magnified, contrary perspectives are inexistent, and this leads to very predictable reactions among these citizen journalists. We will dance again as per promise. May they live a long, healthy life, loving life, and so forth. Another category within the first phase are proxy-based simulacra. What proxy-based simulacra show us is that the institutional gatekeepers that we believe to have no influence anymore still exert a lot of power within social media platforms. As an example, the left-hand side features a news article by Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is known to be quite pro-Palestinian. So the Palestinian subforum often featured these images and videos by pro-Palestinian institutions. Whereas on the right-hand side, we see an image shared by a pro-Israeli institution. So this has been posted on the Palestinian subforum, and this has been posted on the Israeli subforum. So again, physical reality is magnified in the sense of Certain perspectives are shown, others are not shown. And the reactions tend to be quite predictable. But here the difference is that reactions are more orchestrated by how these gatekeepers influence how information is disseminated. So far, it has been quite easy. But as we move to the second phase, things become a bit more complicated. Now we don't have these one-dimensional images and videos. Instead, we often see confrontations between pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli entities. It's becoming increasingly difficult to interpret what is happening within these images. And despite the difficulty of interpreting what is happening, what these images and videos do is they reframe reality. What do we mean by reframe? They essentially vilify the oppositional side and elevate those an audience associates with. And this reframing happens through multivalent and disparate simulacra, which we shall explore in a second. Now, these prosumers, so these citizen journalists, are not only passive reactors to what is happening, instead they become active interrogators. They scrutinize images and videos in order to condemn the oppositional side and reinforce their own beliefs. Let's look into an example. Can anybody make sense of this image or video? Probably not. When I saw this video, I was like, what am I seeing here? How can I make sense of that? Well, but we can clearly see how this video reframes physical reality. What does it do? It portrays the IDF, so the Israeli Defense Forces, as evil and shows the purported innocence of all Palestinians. For example, Comment 2 claims the most moral army of the world. They can rename it to the most Nazi army of the world. Comment 3 claims this should be the most open shut case to present to the ISJ, so International Court of Justice, to implement additional measures. The IDF isn't even trying to hide it. How does this interrogation happen? How does this reframing of physical reality happen? We claim it's because multivalent simulacra, so these more complex images that are open to multiple interpretations, starkly contrast to these one-dimensional images that are quite easy to interpret. So this has subsequent influence on engagement. Now, of course, we can observe the same dynamic on the Israeli side. Can anybody make sense of this video? Probably not. I was like, what am I looking at here? But we can observe the same dynamic from the Israeli point of view. What happens is essentially that Palestinian civilians are portrayed as, or reframed as inherently evil, whereas the IDF is seen as morally pure. So it's the exact opposite narrative. For example, the posting user claims that a Palestinian father is begging IDF soldiers to kill his son. Comment 3 claims in the West Bank in particular, there is a whole industry of people trying to bait the Israeli soldiers. So people scrutinize these videos and images to reframe physical reality. And it's not because of the images or videos themselves in isolation, but it is how these subsequent or these exchanges unfold. Disparate simulacra are also part of the second phase, but they are even more aggressive when it comes to the interrogation. As an example, what you can see here is an image of a police officer from Vancouver. It has been posted on the Palestinian subforum. This circle is not something I added. It is something that was already included. What this is essentially trying to do is claim that because there's a Jewish symbol by this police officer, that the Vancouver police has now been infiltrated by Zionists or extreme Zionists. So, for example, the posting user claims that Vancouver police wearing extremist symbols. Comment 2 claims, why do I get this feeling that Vancouver police is crawling with Zion Nazis? So they interrogate it, which in turn leads to a reframing of reality in the sense that anybody who associates with Israel is automatically an extremist. But of course, we can also see this happening from the Israeli point of view. Here's a news article by the BBC, which reports on the ramifications the war has had on neighboring countries. Of course, the war adversely affects neighboring countries, and what the users, so the citizen journalists among the Palestinian Israeli subforum do is they interrogate it, which leads to a reframing of reality in the sense that the BBC is invalidated. Let's look at an example. BBC has Muslim writers who are really good at painting the picture of the Middle East being a mecca of liberalism. No wonder so many young people are anti-Israel. This level of propaganda is just what the fuck. They have been dropping bombs on Israel for 8 months. I find it strange how people expect Jews to be good and sit still while they get attacked. Interrogation leading to reframing. As we move to the third phase, things become even more absurd. What we are now seeing are images and videos that are not anchored in physical reality. They cannot be traced back to physical reality. They are purely the product of social media simulations. They are in fact the product of the first and second phase, and we are able to trace that. So what do these images and videos do? Well, first of all, they are artificially engineered, and they are engineered in a way that they create narratives that are supposed to superimpose physical reality. We use the word superimpose because they are engaged in truth-making. They make entirely new discourses that challenge what is happening in the physical world. And the superimposition happens through modular and surreal simulacra. What is interesting or even paradoxical about these images and videos is that engagement among these citizen journalists tends to follow a conjuring logic. So people come up with random evidence, random stories and narratives, even though these images and videos are not part of the physical world. But they sort of have evidence for why these engineered images and videos are true. Let's see an example. This is an American politician. This is an image from Nazi Germany, somebody who contested Hitler. Both of these images were actually shared in isolation. So they are first and second phase simulacra. They are together combined, so they are artificially engineered, and they are the product of social media simulations. So what does this image do? It essentially creates a narrative where resistance against Israel is the same as resistance against the Nazis. And we can see this conjuring unfolding. The posting user is claiming that history is repeating itself. So we must resist Israel because that's the same as resistance against the Nazis. Where comment 2, for example, claims strong people stand up for the sense. Or comment 3, brave woman. It takes a lot of guts to do something like that. Or comment 1 claims this photo will go down in history, and the people who are currently supporting Israel will look back and pretend they were. People love to think they're in the right, but they only want to speak up when it's safe to do so. So that's how you can see how these discourses become increasingly radical, and why we can see these protests happening. And of course, the same dynamic can be observed on the Israeli side. So this is a modular simulacrum that has been posted on the Israeli point of view. It equates Nasrallah with Hitler, Stalin, and other dictators. So it creates this radical discourse that kind of tries to justify all means by which Israel is conducting the war. Surreal simulacra are completely detached from reality. They have no physical anchors. They in fact operate only through AI-generated images, memes, whatever. They are completely fabricated. I even had to censor this because it includes a swastika symbol. And interestingly, both of these images do the same thing. On the right-hand side, this has been posted on the Israeli subforum. Every resistance against Israel is seen as the same as being a Nazi. So whenever you protest against Israel, you're also considered a Nazi. Whereas if you protest against Palestine, you're supporting the IDF, which purportedly kill innocent babies. And we can again observe this conjuring, these random narratives unfolding. The title is claiming, as ex-Muslim, I know this is accurate. Comment 2 says, most definitely, I can say that is true in my circle of moderate Muslim family in France. They don't even care for Palestinians. They just want Jews to fail to look bad. As a fellow ex-Muslim, I confirm this. No one in my entourage supports a state solution or any compromise. And on the Palestinian side, we can observe the same thing. The most moral army, so they are obviously making an ironic comment about the IF. here's another common inaccurate. They would shoot the pregnant mothers long before they give themselves the chance to shoot the infant. So to wrap it up, we argue that social media platforms are simulations of physical reality. They create these hyperreal spaces, and we trace how these hyperreal spaces emerge. We trace the emergence of hyperreality by distinguishing between 3 phases of simulacra based on Baldwin's taxonomy. We show that all of these phases operate in a different manner in how they represent reality. They magnify, so these are these one-dimensional images and videos. They reframe it, where one party is portrayed as inherently evil, whereas another one is shown as superior, or they superimpose it by creating entirely new discourses that are intended to challenge what is happening in the physical world. We also show that these 6 subcategories do not operate in isolation. To understand what is happening, we must consider that they are connected. The second phase contrasts with the first. Third phase simulacra are inspired by the first and second phase, so they combine it. And each of these phases tends to elicit more extreme engagements. So in the first phase, it tends to be quite passive in the sense of being reactive. Then people become more hostile and aggressive. They interrogate images and videos. And finally, they begin in a process of truth making. So they generate new narratives. So these certain genres. What's the practical takeaway from here? What can we take home from today? Well, in essence, we must be quite careful with the kind of content we're engaging with, because even seemingly faithful representations of reality can shape subsequent engagement with more fabricated items. That's how these algorithms, how these social media platforms work. And very quickly, we have our own small microcosmic hyperreality where we are not able to distinguish between something that is real and something that has been actually fabricated. And that's just simply the way these social media platforms are designed, because we argue they are simulations. That's their purpose. They are to create these conflicting truths. And this makes them so dangerous. In fact, in our opinion, they are currently more dangerous than AI can be. Maybe a few years, not so much. And then, yeah, of course, we will skip this for now. I think I'm already at 30 minutes now. So if you have any questions, let me know.